Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Karolin Obert. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Lund University, and today I'm going to try to share my path with you on trying to find more common ground and when it comes to approaching or achieving my own goals as a researcher and the goals of the community in documentation projects. But before I start, I would like, of course, to express my gratitude towards the DO and other people who have always been welcoming me in their communities and working with me for quite a long time now. I also would like to thank institutions in Brazil for sponsoring my research, for making that possible. Of course, my colleagues and friends, and funding from NEHDL and Horizon Europe. If you are watching this video, I assume you're probably involved in some sort of documentation activities, and then you're probably also aware that our field has recently been more concerned in how we can kind of combine or bring together the communities and researchers' interests in more efficient ways. So we have been told to design multidisciplinary projects in which kind of the goals and the design are decided conjointly. And also we have heard a lot about collaborative frameworks. However, what we can see and what is oftentimes reported in the literature, and also what I have experienced in meetings in several venues over the last years, is that this seems to be not really reflected in field linguistic research. And the question is, why is that? And here I have some reasons for you that I kind of thought through, or that are very true for me at least. One is that the combination of the very concrete goals that we have from academia with less concrete and more variable goals from the communities can be really tricky. And this is a result of us very often, I think, not having a clear idea what the community actually wants. And it's difficult to pin that down and to have their honest opinions about that. There's also a lot of external pressures from the institutions we are working for, in order to answer big questions in linguistics, so there's not a whole lot of room for subjective goals. And at the end, there's always, as usual with everything, a general lack of time and kind of an overwhelm when it comes to combining these very different demands. So the question I'm raising here, is it then a mission impossible? Or I ask, is it true that it has to be difficult to combine very different goals? And on the other hand, I want to ask, how can we actually reach objective and subjective research goal when doing a documentation project that also takes into account the larger social, political, and cultural context? So what I'm going to do here is sharing a personal account how seemingly diverse agendas of communities, and the researchers can actually grow together if we put some work into that, and share the benefits and drawbacks of such an approach. So after this introduction, we're gonna talk a little bit about the DO, people, language, and project background, and then I will give you a little timeline on how I went from the writing a grammar of space to the construction of a new village, and how these things kind of got together, and what does it still has to do with language documentation at the end. And I will provide then some reflections on the whole process. So just to give you a little background, I'm working in the Upper Rio Negro region, as you can see here in the northwestern Brazilian Amazon, on the border to Venezuela and Colombia, and I'm working with the small Naduhup family, which you can see here, the languages that are marked in green. I focus especially on my work, on the work with DO, and more recently also with Naduhup, although today I will be focusing on DO. That you can see here, a very small group. We have only 160 speakers that live in a single community. And this is our current understanding of the family tree that kind of maps also the geographic distribution of the languages. One background information on the DO people's mobility that is important for understanding a little bit the trajectory of the projects is that not only for being more foraging oriented hunter-gatherers and maintaining kind of a daily spatial mobility, historically they have went through a really long migration from actually here the Middle Rio Negro region to the Upper Rio Negro region. And what is important to note is that while they were doing this, their population has been drastically reduced in the 80s along the Curicuriari River, where they have been involved in extractivist work. And in the 80s, they kind of settled in the single community, in the single Valois community, which is kind of a piece of land that has been purchased at the time by evangelic missionaries. So this background is important, as we will see in a bit. So I'm going to guide you through this trajectory, just really at first sight seemingly weird trajectory about how the grammar of space can lead to the construction of a new village, actually in that territory that we just have seen on the map. So here you can see a little timeline of projects, and if we go from the left to the right, it actually shows us also the increasing community involvement. And I want to show you that by kind of pointing out the goals/results for the community and for me as a researcher. So starting off here, and I intentionally start off with my goals and my results, because that's also how I started out working with the dough. And I say this with a little bit, I say this bashfully, but that's how that worked, unfortunately. So I started out with focusing on, of course, academic production, writing a PhD thesis and creating an archive. For the Dao people, that kind of turned out to have some benefits in the form of the acquisition of technical skills. So people started to get involved in language documentation activities, audiovisual recording, and also working on transcriptions and translations using a computer, and also provided an income. While we were doing this, we started also collecting the biographies and life stories of Dao elders, and this resulted in didactic materials that are now kind of useful for the communities, as some of these people already unfortunately passed away, so people use these materials in order to remind themselves about the life stories. For myself, it was interesting because all these stories kind of yield a huge inventory of place names and of motion events, so it kind of helped me to expand my analysis on the language of space from going through elicitation to, like, of course, natural discourse and interesting features about space that have been present in these narratives. And just to give you a little example here, a story from Donna Anna, where you can see several place names and also, of course, other really linguistic interesting features, for example, social linguistic background or linguistic biographies. But when we were doing these stories, the Dao people like increasingly asked about all these place names, and they were thinking like, oh, we actually don't really know where these places are, we don't remember, and our kids don't know. So there was a growing interest into visiting these places. So we sat down and wrote actually a documentation project on the idea of memory, landscape, and territory, which was approved by 2 funding agencies. And while we were doing this, the community achieved really nice goals, which was like the acquisition of ethnomapping skills, which produced maps for territory protection, and the clearing of certain paths that are now that the Dao people are now using for certain subsistence or forest management activities. For me, it was really fruitful because I engaged in a novel methodology and on-site data collection, pairing spatial data and so GIS data and language data, and I could expand my collection of landscape terms and place names. And that just looked like this. Here just some pictures of how that looked like. So we were documenting all sorts of activities that are related to the Dao people's mobility in the forest. It's just a little video clip from Seu Jair telling a little bit, just to exemplify how that looked like in video. So Seu Jair is kind of repeating the path that we went along this river by mentioning all these place names And we were able to finally produce these maps that the Dao people nowadays use strategically in meetings when it comes to land rights and so on. For me, as a researcher, what was really cool about this is that actually all these texts that I was collecting on site provided me with an unexpected inventory of motion verbs that is described in linguistic typology of being unusual for kind of conflating the notions of motion, ground, and path, as you can see here. For example, if you compare the first three verbs, we have shak, pe, and shop that involve a movement, an upward movement, and they are differing with respect to the ground speakers are moving. So it reveals culturally and environmentally salient features, and it kind of is a window into the representation of the Dao people's mobility in their own terms, which are investigations that are kind of not common. And finally, when we were doing these journeys on foot and canoe, we came by this one old site, which is called Sitio Beling, and nowadays it's called Sitio Perha. And the Dao people said, we actually want to frequent this place more. We want to be here. So we sat down for 4 weeks and elaborated a new project, which was providing the Dao people with resources for the construction of this house site, and ended up in really being a new village constructed. And this allows for new interactions with the ancestral land, since it's being frequented by many Dao families, and this happens very, very frequently. For me, it was really interesting because I was kind of receiving recordings on that process that came from the Dao people themselves. And here, just to illustrate that a little bit, how the process looked like, those are pictures taken by the Dao people during the pandemic. So this construction happened during the pandemic and was fairly self-administered. So I was just kind of being the liaison between the funding agency and the Dao people because of connection issues and so on. And here's just a video recording that I got throughout this process. So, of course, as you can see, this is a video that has been filmed by on a phone. So, of course, we have to make some compromises when it comes to quality, maybe, and audio recording. But this is nothing that we cannot work with a community. But still, having this record is really valuable, in my opinion. So, some final reflections on that. What does that actually require from us as a researcher if we want to engage in that sort of project? So, one is, I think we have to allow ourselves to spend more time in the field before writing a grant application, before actually having a real idea of what the community's goals are. Another thing that is more difficult, I guess, is try to let go a little bit more of the academic pressures in order to being able to adapt or to make space for the community's goals. Also, a really interesting experience for myself was like leaning into letting data emerge and then have a creative plan on what to do with these data, rather than have a fixed agenda on what sort of data we want to collect. And also something that I think is important is reminding ourselves that we as linguists or anthropologists or people, language activists, we actually have something to offer that goes beyond developing orthography and teaching literacy. And this is not to say that these things aren't valid or important. Those things are very, very important, but sometimes it's maybe not what the community needs in that moment. What are the overall benefits of such an approach? So one thing that I think is really crucial is it kind of loosens up the traditional idea of having a main consultant, since it can include people from all over the community in very different functions of the project. So may that be the person who clears the path, or the person who strategically plans the route for conducting the material to the new house site, the person who's checking the community's bank account on a regular basis. So all of this kind of has them really be part of the project, and that can also go beyond mere linguistic work or documentation work. And it also redefines kind of a service relationship by equaling out hierarchies. Finally, like a form of domain-driven documentation, as this is, like in this case it was let's say the domain of territory or landscape, can increase the potential for the community's participation if it's really something they're interested in. And we can talk later or in person about maybe ideas that came up with your community and how we can develop projects around that. And it allows for interdisciplinary collaborations. In my case, I was able to collaborate, of course, with anthropologists and also with geographers when it came to the mapping part, for example. For communities, what I've been observing is that it can be really beneficial to increase the community self-esteem and the recognition from local authorities. This is something that has been happening a lot with the Dao people, and this has been visible. Like, for example, if there are meetings, educational meetings that address several communities in the region, they're, for example, now held in the Dao community for just being more visible, for being considered as groups who are able to implement projects. So they have been addressed and consulted, even for being liaisons for other communities' projects, but of course has done something to the community's image and self-image. Of course, by being really intensively involved in projects that produces skills to navigate future projects themselves, is something that's going on now, and it can produce maintenance and transmission of language and culture kind of through the back door. Once, imagine, like when people were constructing this house site, they were having tons of meetings. These meetings are held in the language, and of course they involve culturally relevant practices, such as, for example, choosing routes, making sure there is food at the place when people are constructing. So there's kind of a transmission of culture and language that is just implicitly and omnipresently happening. For us as a researcher, I felt that it kind of facilitates long-term relationships of trust when people feel, okay, she's not only here to write her book, she's here to do something with us. And it also, in my opinion, kind of increases the willingness and in the engagement, and also the linguistic side of the project. So I felt that people were more willing to increase in kind of boring, some sort of boring elicitation task, because they knew, no, she's helping us, so now I'm going to help her. So kind of the one hand washes the other principle. And it's also a continuous source of data, as you have seen. Like, just the documentation part has been kind of growing or have kind of been a stable part of all sorts of projects that come along with that. And we just benefit from this data. And the community too, thinking about producing an archive. And it yields data surprises for us. What are the drawbacks of such an approach? It sounds great, but of course there are things that are very, very difficult. One is, of course, an increased workload. We will have to manage basically several projects, because several of the projects you have seen that have been done by the community are projects that yield funds for the community, but not for me. So I have to have my own funds, and this means having an own documentation project. And that means administering two projects kind of at the same time. It requires time commitment beyond the field. So I think our field time is not done when we are leaving. That means like being in constant communication with the community, if possible, and assisting them remotely and supporting them with when it comes to technical or logistic things that we have to just help them solving. And another thing, and this can be hard, is it's just harder to set boundaries. Right. If we engage in projects that kind of address sometimes problems that the communities have, they will probably ask for your help with many, many other problems that are related to that. And then you have to consider, okay, can I actually do that? Can I afford that? Can I help with that? And this is sometimes hard, I think, to really draw a line there. So my final implications are, by reassessing a kind of a fixed pre-field scientific agenda and combining them with the community's agenda, we may be able to hit many birds with the same stone. I know it's a weird saying, but that's actually what happens. So if we're asked to enlarge the empirical basis, we can do this with unexpected linguistic data. If another goal is to support maintenance of language and culture, we can do this through less conventional and unexpected ways and maybe go beyond producing a dictionary or didactic materials. And this will help us to support the community's ideas and plans that go beyond language-focused activities. So thank you. I'm a little bit over time, and here are my references. And yeah, feel free to send me an email if you have any questions with respect to the topic. Thank you.